You're listening to the Haunted UK podcast, where paranormal stories from around the world refuse to stay buried. If you want to help us keep uncovering the unseen, support us on Patreon or leave an offering on Ko-fi. Now sit back, dim the lights, and don't look behind you. Welcome to Dark Matters, a mini-series from the Haunted UK podcast. Here we examine stories already etched into the public record, disturbing incidents, unexplained events, enduring mysteries, and accounts that continue to trouble the boundary between truth and belief. These are the cases that remain unsolved, not because they were forgotten, but because no one has ever managed to explain them away. What if I told you that one of Britain's strangest winged creatures was said to appear not over some remote mountain or deep inside some forgotten forest, but above the tower of an ancient Cornish church? Some places seem to invite stories, not because anything can be proven there, not because every whisper attached to them is true, but because the place itself seems to make room for them. The landscape, the silence, the old stone, the feeling that something about it all belongs more to another age than to the one we live in now. St Mawnan Church in Cornwall is one of those places. It sits among trees above the Helford River, old and weathered and slightly removed from the world around it. It's the kind of place that already feels like it has a memory. The kind of place where, if somebody told you they'd seen something impossible above the roofline at dusk, you might not laugh straight away. And for years now, one story in particular has clung to that church more tightly than any other. The story of the Owlman. Now, this is one of those cases that lives right on the border between witness account and folklore. There are names, there are dates, there are repeated details, but there's also embellishment, myth-making, and the influence of at least one man who understood very well how mystery can be shaped, encouraged, and turned into something larger than life. So this isn't really a story about proof. It's a story about how a legend begins, how it grows, and why, long after the facts have thinned out, the image still remains. There is supposedly an older thread to the story, a kind of precursor. According to later retellings, back in 1926, two boys near the church were chased by what was described as a, quote, very large and ferocious bird, end quote. The story says they hid behind a metal grating until it had gone. Now, that account is worth including, but carefully. It belongs more to the folklore around Owlman than to the strongest part of the case itself. It survives its later retellings rather than in the sort of solid documentation you'd want if you were trying to build a hard evidence-based timeline. But still, it matters, because it gives the legend a shadow behind it. It creates the impression that whatever was seen at St Mawnan in later years may not have been the beginning at all, only the moment the story finally found its shape. And that shape really starts to form in 1976. That spring, two sisters, usually named as Vicky and June Melling, were said to be visiting the area on holiday. Near the church, one of them reportedly saw something near the tower. Not just a bird, not just a movement in the corner of the eye. Something larger, stranger, and somehow wrong. Later descriptions speak of glowing red eyes, broad wings, and claws like blacksmith's pincers. It's the sort of description that stays with you because it feels just close enough to the natural world to be imaginable, but just distorted enough to become monstrous. One of the girls drew what she'd seen, and that drawing became central to the legend. Because once there's an image, the story changes. It stops being just a private fright. It becomes something others can picture, something they can pass on. And that's often how these stories survive. Not through evidence, but through imagery, through a shape that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. A few months later, in July of the same year, another report appeared. This time, the names usually given are Barbara Perry and Sally Chapman, two young women camping nearby. Their account added another detail that matters, and that is sound. According to later retellings, they heard a strange hissing noise and went to investigate. At first, they thought it might be somebody in costume, a prank, a figure moving oddly in poor light. But then, the story says, the thing spread its wings, lifted into the air, and vanished over the trees. And that's the moment where the story hardens. An old church, a winged thing, red eyes hissing from the trees, a glimpse overhead, a feeling of fear before understanding. All of it happening in a place already eerie enough to do half the work for the legend. But this is also where the case becomes more complicated, because the Owlman story is closely tied to Tony Doc Shields. And Doc Shields was not simply somebody who collected strange reports and passed them on. Depending on who you ask, he was a magician, an artist, an occult showman, a trickster, a hoaxer, or some combination of all of them. He moved through the stranger corners of British culture as somebody who seemed to understand that mystery isn't always discovered. Sometimes it's created, or at least encouraged. That doesn't mean the witnesses invented what they saw. It doesn't mean nobody experienced anything strange near St Mawnan Church. But it does mean the case has to be handled with care, because now there are really two questions. The first is, what, if anything, did people see near that church? And the second is, how did that become the Owlman? Those aren't the same question, and it's in the gap between them that the story gets interesting. There are other layers too. Some later tellings pull in old occurrents of occult folklore, ritual, and surrealist weirdness. In some versions, the area becomes tied to ideas about summoning or contacting some bird-like entity, with later writers linking the place to figures like Max Ernst. It's exactly the sort of detail that makes the story richer and stranger, but it's also the sort of detail that belongs far more to the legend than to the evidence. It gives the Owlman atmosphere. It gives it mythology, but it doesn't give it proof. And that really is the nature of the case. The further out you go, the more elaborate it becomes. The more symbols it gathers, the more history seems to collect around it. But when you strip it back, the core is surprisingly small. A church, a few witnesses, a creature described as owl-like, man-like, and deeply unsettling. A sketch, a handful of repeated details, and one very influential figure standing close to the center of the story as it spread. So, what was Owlman? The most grounded explanation is also the least romantic. A large bird, misidentified in poor light, in the sort of setting where fear can do the rest. And really, that isn't a weak explanation at all. Old churches and towers are exactly the sort of places where birds perch and nest. In dim light, at the wrong angle, with the mind already unsettled, something ordinary can become something monstrous very quickly. A silhouette becomes a face, eyes catch the light and seem to glow. Talons become iron tools and wings become arms. And once the fear sets in, the memory starts shaping itself into something even stranger. But even if you take that explanation seriously, the story doesn't lose all its power. Because the Owlman doesn't survive as a legend because it was proven. It survives because it's vivid. Because it gives people something they can see in their minds. That church tower, those trees, the Cornish dusk, and then a shape overhead. Too large to feel comfortable, too strange to be certain about. One later witness described the experience as a vision from hell and as something totally irrational and dreamlike. And dreamlike might be the right word for it, because dreams don't convince us in the way facts do. They linger in a different way. They stay with us because they feel charged, symbolic and half understood. And maybe that's exactly what the Owlman is now. Not a mystery solved, not a proven creature, but a perfect modern legend. A story built from a real place, a few frightened reports, a questionable ringmaster, and just enough uncertainty to keep it alive. So if you ever find yourself near St Mawnan, with the light draining out of the sky and the tower darkening above the trees, you can tell yourself it was only ever folklore, only misidentification, only fear, only a bird. But even then, I suspect you'd still look up. Just once. If you'd like to support the Haunted UK podcast and the work that goes into the show, you can find us on Patreon and Ko-fi. Every bit of support helps us continue uncovering the cases, stories, and strange events that still cast a shadow long after the headlines fade. This has been Dark Matters. If there's a story, case, or unexplained event you'd like us to examine, email us at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com. Not every mystery fades with time. Some only grow darker.